Thanks for joining me on episode 520 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Annie Purdue Olson from Leading Better Together. I encourage you to find the courage to lead in ministry well. And one way to be inspired to do that is by listening to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Meader.
When an emergency comes up, I have no choice but to put it on a credit card. When certain bills come up, I have no choice but to put it on a credit card because I just don't have any money left. That's what's happening. You're seeing the reality of that situation. You're seeing the fact that if you plan for all the stuff that you know is coming up, you're actually spending more than you make.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in yourself through stewarding your treasures, I talk with you about what is a sinking fund, why you need to care about this, and how this can really help you get control of your money this year. As we talk about stewarding your treasures, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without costing yourself an extra dime? Turns out you can. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show. If you enjoy the show when you're ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon. Today, I'm going to talk about one of those concepts that we use in money management and in budgeting and bookkeeping and these sorts of things that oftentimes people don't know about or don't think about, but it's a small trick. It's something that you can implement starting right now that would totally change your finances for the entire year. And this idea is the idea of a sinking fund. Now, first off, that name doesn't really mean anything, and that's part of the problem. Accounting people, just like everybody else, money people have their own language. They have their own terms that they use. This term actually comes from commercial real estate management. The idea is if you own something like a commercial building, then oftentimes doing something like replacing the roof requires a huge investment of money. It might be $50,000 or $100,000 to replace the roof, for instance. This could also be true of an air conditioning units and other things, flooring, other things that are maintenance on the building. And they're somewhat predictable. If you buy a roof that's rated to last 20 years, you know that for sure, after about 20 years, you're going to need to replace the roof. You might need to replace it a little earlier than that too, but for sure, after 20 years, you're going to have to replace it. And it's going to be this huge outlay of money. So one of the things that they do is they'll actually set up an account called a sinking fund for the roof. In other words, they set up a special savings account and they label it replacing the roof. And then they figure out, hey, replacing a roof is going to cost about $50,000 and we've got 15 years to do it. So if we take $50,000 divided by 15 years, that's how much we have to save every year. And then divide that by 12, that's how much we have to save every month. And then they basically just set it up so that money goes into that sinking fund account every single month. And then when it's time to actually replace the roof, the money's sitting there waiting. It's ready to go to replace the roof. It's a concept that we use often for big purchases and big things. But guess what? You can use this in your personal finances as well. Most of us have certain things that we pay annually or quarterly instead of monthly, or sometimes even bi-annually, twice a year. You have certain things that come up on a regular schedule they're not necessarily completely predictable, but you know when they're due. So a good example of that is an insurance payment. A lot of times people pay their insurance quarterly or annually, and for car insurance and for property insurance. Taxes is something else that comes up periodically, especially if you're a small business owner. The other things like Christmas time, buying gifts for Christmas is something that comes up on a regular schedule. So when I begin to identify these things, and there's different things for different people, what you can begin to do is divide the amount of time you have before that event occurs, tuition for the kids' school that we pay every year, and then divide, and then set aside that much every single month. And then what happens is when it comes time to actually pay for that large expense, you've got the money. And so instead of having to put it on a credit card and then struggle for weeks and weeks and weeks to pay it back, or months and months and months sometimes, or sometimes even years, you've got the cash, you pay for it, and everything is much better in that respect. This is about planning ahead for certain expenses that you can kind of know are coming. And there's a lot of them in our life. There's a lot of things that we come up with. Oftentimes, too, you can leverage this to get discounts. For instance, here where I live, if I pay my property taxes in full in January, we actually get a discount on our property taxes because you can pay it over like 4 months or 3 months in small segments, but they actually give you a reward for paying it in full. So we just make sure we've got the money in the account because we know roughly what our property taxes are going to be, and we just save up for it throughout the entire year. And then in January, when it's time to write a check, we just write a check. Our life insurance bill is that way. Our auto insurance bill is that way. And we actually get discounts by paying in full up front because a lot of people don't do that. And so this is a way you can leverage the money you do have. And you can use it to really get control of your money. The first step, of course, is to identify what expenses qualify for you. And again, there could be lots, but they're going to be different for different people. So go through your expenses from last year and start to identify what are those things that come up, and then put them on a calendar, kind of figure out the timing of them. Figure out roughly how much they are, and then begin to put those things into your budget as sinking funds. Now, let me warn you, as you do this, you may suddenly discover that when you get to the bottom of your budget, you no longer have enough money coming in, that you've got more going out than you have coming in when you account for all of these periodic expenses. This happens a lot, and this is kind of that feeling that you've had where you feel like, oh, I make so much money, but yet I keep going into debt. I keep actually not having money when I need it. When an emergency comes up, I have no choice but to put it on a credit card. When certain bills come up, I have no choice but to put it on a credit card because I just don't have any money left. That's what's happening. You're seeing the reality of that situation. You're seeing the fact that if you plan for all the stuff that you know is coming up, you're actually spending more than you make. And so then you begin to have to identify your priorities. You have to identify your values. You have to start going through your budget and identifying what are those things that I need to keep? What are those things that are so important that I am committed to keeping them in my budget? What am I first going to say yes to? And I'll give you a hint. One of the very first things you say yes to is food. You need to eat first. Eating is more important than paying Visa. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't pay Visa, don't pay your debts. I'm saying if that was the choice, I'm going to eat or I'm going to pay my credit card bill, I'm going to eat first. I'm not going to eat filet mignon, but I'm going to eat. But what happens is you begin to go through this and suddenly you'll begin to see some things that you're spending money on now that in the big picture aren't that big of a deal. And you can begin to eliminate those things from your budget one at a time. Those things can go away because you don't really care if they're there. It becomes not what you say no to that's important, but what you say yes to in your budget. So I encourage you, if you do a budget, implement sinking funds into it if you aren't already using them. If you need help with this and want some help setting it up, please reach out to me. Send me an email at scott@inspiredstewardship.com. We'll set up a 30-minute meeting and I'll help you begin to implement budgeting and sinking funds and mindset and behavior and habits that will completely change the way you handle your money. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of treasures, you can sign up for our treasures tips by going to inspiredstewardship.com/treasures or text in the U.S. 44222 treasures tips. And we'll send you 5 weeks of our best tips on stewarding your treasures. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.